Hello there, I've got a treat for you this month. I'm going to do 2 wrap-ups because I have read so much that I could not physically fit it into a small wrap-up at all. So I was going to split it for you. So this is the first half. This month I've done both the Dewey's 24-hour readathon and the genreathon. I think that's why I've got such a large pile. In this is the things I read at the start of the month and the things I read during the genreathon. And in the next section will be the stuff I read in Dewey's, etc. So let's get straight into this. Firstly, I read Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. I'm not going to go into this too much, but I have become vegan this month. And I had this on my shelf anyway because I love Jonathan Safran Foer. I was vegetarian before that anyway, so I wanted to read this. I enjoyed it and I gave it 5 stars because I think it's important, but also I don't think it should be important because I think everything that was in here is things that people should already know, but strangely people don't know. For me, I've been vegetarian since I was like 7. I had a small lapse when I was in my teen years, but other than that I've always been vegetarian, and this has always been stuff that I've been very aware of because I don't believe in denial, and I think a lot of people are in denial about the animal agriculture situation and animal farming. And in this it basically just outlines the hard, cruel facts. It's not an easy read. There are some scenes in here that are really horrible, obviously, but in general it's worth the read. It's well worth the read. It's really interesting and it's fascinating. Basically, Jonathan Safran Foer went on a journey through the animal farming system when he had a child, and he wanted to know how was best to raise that child. He'd sort of been an occasional vegetarian, but sometimes he would eat meat, and when he had a child he felt a responsibility to find out about the sources of this meat and what was going on in the world that would be best to feed his son. And he went into it with quite an unbiased opinion, which I think is good. It's not all about the bad stuff. There is good stuff in there as well. For example, there's he has like extracts from people who are involved in the farming industry. There's extracts from, one of them is a vegetarian farmer who has a sort of organic farm and is saying that, you know, she does it because she wants to change it from the inside, and just not eating meat wouldn't be enough for her. She needs to be involved so that she knows that her cows at least have a good life, which is quite a really interesting viewpoint. There's also interviews with people who are involved in factory farming, saying about the fact that, you know, people can complain about it, but at the end of the day people want the meat for cheap and they want a lot of it, and therefore they're just providing a service, which is also valid. You know, it's really interesting. It looks at it from a lot of different angles and it's well worth a read, definitely. Especially if you're thinking about going vegetarian or something like that, I would definitely recommend. Then I read The Beast That Is the Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. Sadly, as my reading it, it's kind of got faded, which is a bit of a shame, but never mind. This is a very big book. However, I got through it in a week. I absolutely loved it. It is the fastest paced book I've read in ages and I just adored it. Basically, there's a lot of stuff in here that I probably didn't pick up on, in terms of there's sort of cosmological stuff going on in there, and at the start of the chapters we have these sort of things, and some of them are sort of, the chapters will be headed with the sun is in Leo or whatever. That stuff was completely over my head. I don't know anything about cosmology, but I still really enjoyed this. I don't think you need to know that at all. Obviously, I think knowing about that stuff would probably give this book an extra added thing, but I think it's completely enjoyable anyway. This is like a soap opera. It basically starts, we have Walter Moody. He has ended up, unfortunately, in a meeting. He's basically just rocked into New Zealand. Everyone's going to New Zealand for the gold rush, and Walter Moody is no different. He's gone there to make his fortune. He's booked in at a hotel, and he's in the hotel lobby, and he realises that something quite strange is going on. He has unfortunately walked into a meeting of the sort of men of the village, and they are basically discussing a death that has happened in the village and what they think about it, and it all just goes from there. And it's such an intricately plotted story, and it's basically about the effect of these horrible people and how much of an impact, like, the effects just ripple out of what they've done. And what's interesting in this is that none of the characters are good. Like, everybody who's, apart from Walter Moody, but even he is not the loveliest person, but everyone who's in the meeting has got a connection to the issues in some way. They benefit or don't benefit from it in some form or other, and they're all completely in it for themselves. And it's really funny because All of them are flawed. None of them are perfect. None of them are innocent in the situation. And yet you like them. It's hilarious. It's got just the right sort of timing with the comedy. It's fantastic. And it sort of pokes fun at its own absurdity. It's just so good. It was literally like a soap opera in a book. I could not put this down. I would recommend this to anybody. Ooh, chucking it away. Then I read, these are my genreathon reads. I also finished the Luminaries during the genreathon as well. And then I read Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson. This is a lovely book. I went into it thinking that it was solely about her journey to find her birth mother. That is in there, but we look at her life as a whole. So a lot of the time we look at her and Miss Winterson, her adopted mother. And what I found really touching about this book is that Miss Winterson did some awful things to her. You know, I'm sure a lot of people have heard the story of when Jeanette wasn't allowed to read books unless they were sort of religious books. So she would hide books under her bed, and her mum found them and burnt them all in the garden one day. And if Jeanette did something wrong, she would be left outside all night. And Jeanette fell in love with a woman when she was 16, and her mum pretty much told her to leave, using the words, why be happy when you could be normal, when Jeanette said that she was happy. And Mrs. Winterson is generally she does horrendous things. Like one day she won't sleep and she'll sit up all night reading the Bible, cooking things and be really hyper, and then she will crash and she'll just stay in bed for days and days and days, so almost like she's depressed or something like that. And Jeanette had put up with this, and she ends up obviously leaving when she's 16 and living in a mini for a while because her mum literally does just chuck her out. And yet, with all of this, and you know, the last time Jeanette saw her mum or Mrs. Winterson was actually when she went home with a friend, and the same thing happened where Mrs. Winterson was just in one of her down periods, and it was quite bizarre, and Jeanette ended up leaving early and sort of going quite quickly. And even with all of this, and even with that bad last meeting, she has this love for Mrs. Winterson that really shines through in this, and I think it's really touching when she meets her real mum. Obviously her real mum's quite quick to jump on Mrs. Winterson, and Jeanette is really quite defensive of that lady because that's the woman that brought her up, that is her mum, and she does love her despite her flaws, and I think that's really the touching thing that comes through in this book. Also, Jeanette Winterson just has some lovely observations in this. We don't only follow her relationship with Mrs. Winterson, we follow her throughout her life, and she's just got some wonderful observations. There's a lot in here about the fact that actually a lot of her life she's been on this search for love and how important love is to her, and a lot of her books sort of seem to, when she goes back and looks at them, centre around the idea of what is the perfect love sort of thing. And it's just a really lovely read. I would definitely recommend it. Then I read Wonder by R.J. Palacio. I've had it on my shelf for a long time, never picked it up. I don't really know how to speak about this book because I enjoyed it and it was fine, and it's basically about August, who is a 10-year-old boy who is going to school for the first time. He's been homeschooled up until now because he has a severe deformity. It's sort of hard to picture what that deformity would be, but basically he says, you know, whatever you think I look like, I look worse, and he's sort of described as sort of ET-esque. He has trouble eating because his mouth is basically being formed by doctors and things like that. And it's basically about his struggle at school. What was touching about this was that, yes, there was a lot in there about his deformity, but like on his first day of school, he had all the same issues that any kid would have. And, you know, he went home and he was all moody at his mum and he didn't want to talk about his day, even though he'd had a good day, and things like this. And that was really nice, I thought. And obviously he does suffer from some really horrendous discrimination because of his deformity, and he's quite a strong person that he doesn't actually let it bother him because he has his friendship group and he hadn't expected to actually have them, so he doesn't mind that the other people sort of still pick on him. As I say, I did enjoy it and it is important, and I think it's really good, and I think for the age range that it's aimed at, I think it would be quite a transformative book in terms of just acceptance and realising that people aren't different from you just because they look different. But I found it, like, when I looked back on it, I didn't feel that much had actually happened in it, and I felt like there was certainly one bit with the family dog that was just kind of unnecessary. It was filler. It was complete filler. But, you know, I did still enjoy it. I would still recommend it. I would also say they're meant to be 10 years old, but they kind of act more like 13, 14-year-olds. Just a opinion. I don't know kids, so maybe 10-year-olds are more like that now, but when I was growing up, I would have thought these were more like 13, 14-year-olds than 10-year-olds. But anyway, then I also read Kirsty Logan's The Rental Heart and Other Stories. I really did like this, actually. As you can see, I tabbed quite a lot. It took me a while to get into. I liked The Rental Heart, the title story, which is the first story in here, which is really lovely, about the idea that every time somebody breaks your heart, you can swap it for a new one, or every time you don't want to be in a relationship anymore, you just swap your heart out, sort of thing. That I really liked. I kind of think my problem was that I went into this forgetting that it was often based on fairy stories, and I was reading a lot of the stories and thinking, I do not understand. It's almost like there's some backstory that I didn't get. And then I remembered that it's fairy stories, so I went back and read through it, and actually I did enjoy quite a few of them. There's a really good one in here about, it's a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, and she is asleep, and obviously a man takes advantage of her, which is quite an interesting take on it. Excuse me. There's also a story in here about a woman, my favourite story I think in here, about a woman who eats Christmas lights. And that was really lovely. So yes, there are some good stories in here and I would recommend it, and I can't wait to read more Kirsty Logan. Then finally I've got Station 11 by Emily St John Mandel. This was a really good story. Basically, I wouldn't say this is dystopian, I would say this is apocalyptic, because it's literally our day and age. Everything's the same, only the world ends all of a sudden when there is a sort of drastic flu that sweeps through the environment and kills a lot of people. Not all of them, but probably 99.9% of the population. And we have sort of two timelines in this book. One is before the flu, and the second is about 20 years after the flu has happened, how they are surviving now. I actually preferred the parts that were before the flu, but the parts that were after the flu were enjoyable as well. I would say our main character in this is Arthur, whom we meet at the beginning. In the first chapter, he is in a production of Shakespeare and he dies from a heart attack literally the night before the flu comes. And it's basically, I say he was the main character because even though he dies right at the start, he is in it. We go back further than that and sort of look at his life. But everybody in this is somehow connected to him. So he's sort of the central character in this. And say we go into the future and our main character is Kirsten, who was a little girl that was also in the production of King Lear that Arthur was in when he died. And she sort of references that time. And in the future, she is in a travelling Shakespeare production company who travel around the after-death world and produce Shakespeare plays for people to watch. There's a lot about Shakespeare in here. I'm not the best on my Shakespeare knowledge, though I do intend to change that soon. So I think there was probably a lot of references that I missed in this. One video I will link you to is Jane Campbell's review of this down below, where she talks about more the Shakespearean references in here and how clever it is. I obviously didn't pick up on a lot of that, but I still loved this. I thought it was really good. There is a lot of themes in here about also acting, obviously, with the Shakespeare play and the travelling Shakespeare company, and also with Arthur. It's quite interesting because when we go back and look at his life as a whole and his career as a whole, there's a lot of times when he'll meet up with somebody and they'll say, you know, you could tell that he was acting at being himself. He was acting at being a middle-aged actor. And that's quite an interesting concept. I really liked that aspect of it. This is really good. I would really recommend. It's probably the best dystopian apocalyptic thing I have read in recent years. And it's much more thoughtful than a lot of them, where it's literally just, oh, the end of the world. I think because we had the aspect of going back and looking at these people's lives, it sort of added a really nice depth to this book that I really enjoyed. So again, I would recommend that one. So it's generally been a pretty good start to the month, and I will obviously talk to you about the other books in the future. So I'll see you soon. Bye.